first session of the second day of this conference, and we welcome you all, and we welcome as well, welcome Mr. Khaldi and Mr. Ammar Dweik, and Ammar Al-Akir if he's still here, if he's here as well. And Mr. Ammar Dweik is going to start with us. A little change in the program, in the session program, because Layla Farsakh is not going to be with us. She apologized, and therefore we have two interventionists. The first one is going to be started by Mr. Ammar Dweik, which is legislation without legislators. And Mr. Ammar is a lawyer and member of the Faculty of Law at Birzeit University and General Administration. He has a BA in MA in Law and doctorate in Public Policies. Professor Rajal Khaldi then is going to make an intervention. Is there a Palestinian economy? Entitled "Is There a Palestinian Economy?" He's specialized in Palestinian economic studies. He worked between 1985 and 2013 at UNCTAD in Geneva. So we welcome the interventionists, and we're going to have sufficient time for discussion in well thought of manner, better than yesterday. Yesterday it was very crowded, very rich agenda. So we hope, and we'll give about half an hour for each interventionist for his intervention, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Without any due I will give the floor to Mr. Ammar to start his intervention, and welcome you all again. The topic of my paper is legislation without legislators, which I meant to shed light on the period that followed the division or the split, the political split, in which President Mahmoud Abbas assumed the legislative power and started to issue decree bylaws, the number of which now is 110. But in fact, through the study and review, I discovered that by going to the various legislation stages that preceded 2007, and the establishment of the PLC, there was a similarity between all the stages since the inception of the authority until now. So the Palestinian Authority, the making of legislation, passed formally on regarding who is issuing the legislations, passed through three stages: 1994 until the election of the PLC, which is the establishment of the authority, until the election of the PLC in January 1996. At that time, the legislation power was the authority council of 22 ministers headed by Yasser Arafat, and it was the legislation authority, and the legislation authority was in the hands of Arafat. At that time, President Arafat, it is a short period, less than 1.5 years, he issued 23 laws, and if we take relatively, he was in the one who issued the largest number of legislation in such a period of time. The nature of these legislations before the elections of 1996 shows that they are of constitutional nature. Most important is the law for devolution of power and to move from the military authorities which existed before, and then the elections law that paved the way for the elections. And there were also laws of economic nature like the apartments and the condominium law that contributed to to the construction and services in Ramallah, and that helped in the property transactions easily, and the investment promotion law, and as well as the communication law. It was clear that President Arafat continued his legislation authority even until the eve of the elections in 1996. For instance, the eve of the elections took place on 19th of January. And that eve itself, he issued two laws, the communication law that laid the foundation for the monopoly of the communication company that is still applicable until now, and no one is daring to modify it. And the water authority law, the water authority was modified later. And he issued before the elections, he issued the investment promotion law that facilitated giving facilitations to the major investors. Among the laws issued by the president was the publication law, and it showed the beginning of the Palestinian Authority approaches towards restricting the space of freedoms. This publication law, which was published in 1995, was very bad regarding restrictions on the expression of opinion and prisons for those who violate the law, and imprisoning writers and journalists, and issued the restrictions on what could be published, and put it in a loose way that can be explained different way. My talk today could be explained against the law. So this law, yes, Arafat did not, contrary to what is said about him, that he didn't rely on law and did not respect law and was counting on personal relations, but really 1 year and a half showed the attitudes of the authority in having legislations. In 1996, the second stage, in 1996 until the 2007, which is the division, we had the PLC, the Palestinian Legislative Council, two legislative council. The first one is continued for 10 years. Over these 10 years, it issued 90 laws, only 90 laws, 90 laws. And 90 laws, about 20 of them were amendments of other laws issued by the council, like issued the law for the bar association, and another law that modified it. The procedures law procedures was also amended. So in 10 years, 70 laws is a very limited number of laws compared to with the Israeli occupation. Rajesh Hadi wrote about the military orders. More than 1,600 military orders were issued by the occupation from 1967, maybe 1,800 in the West Bank alone. So it changed the legislative structure totally. So the Legislative Council issued only 70 laws or 90 laws during that period. Yasser Arafat was rejecting ratifying these laws, and including the Basic Law, which was enacted in 1997, and the President ratified it in 2002. And 2003, it was amended. In my modest opinion as a researcher, the laws that were enacted did not impose any restrictions on Yasser Arafat, and they were not different from the laws that were issued before the PLC establishment, and with the laws that were issued by the president. But he did not ratify because of a contest inside the PLC, and he wanted to show that the PLC is weak. From the beginning of 2007, where division took place, until now, this witnessed an legislative activity. 110 decrees by law were issued based on Article 3 of the Basic Law that allows the chairman of the PLC, or the chairman of the authority, to in situations of urgency to issue decree by laws. So the president issued 110 decrees by law. These 110, in order to be objective, they are not all laws. They take the form of laws, but from the 110, about 70 are only laws. The others either ratifying the public budget or the formation of the government, or laws that are called laws, but they are addressing individuals or people. Like, for instance, the law for endorsing the appointment of the head of the anti-corruption commission, or the chairman of the audit bureau. Or so the irony here is we have a constitutional court. This is very interesting in the case of Dahlan. Dahlan, of course, the president issued a decree by law removing immunity, or his immunity, and then he addressed the higher court, challenging this decree. And the court came up with it said the origin thing, in order for anything to be a law, then it should be a general rule that address everyone, not individuals, not certain individuals. Otherwise, it will not be considered a law. The decree by law and removing immunity of Dahlan, despite the fact that it was a decree by law, but it was a decision, but not a law. And then, since it is not a law, and then we are a court that we study the constitutionality of laws, then this is not within our jurisdiction to discuss or to look into this thing. With this phrase, they said that about from 110 decrees by law issued by the president, I counted them. There are about 30 of them are not laws, according in light of what the court said. And there are decrees but we're talking about 70 laws, which is close to the number of the laws issued by the PLC in 10 years. Despite the differences of the mechanisms of enacting laws, the president, PLC, and whatever. What draws the attention is the similarity among these laws. They are similar. First, that all in the three stages, there was a strong commitment to the Oslo ceiling, and there was a commitment to no legislation outside the ambit of Oslo. According to my knowledge, there was no laws except one law that is symbolic, that has no value on the ground, which is the law for the capital. There is no other laws enacted out of Oslo. Israel said it never interfered in the Palestinian legislations except this law for the capital, and because the PLC did not leave any reason for Israel to intervene. It did not try to do any legislation out of the Oslo boundaries. So, like, for instance, the procurement law, we are committed to Oslo. Customs is planning in sea areas is committed to Oslo, and the Israeli military orders. All these aspects that are regulated by Oslo, the civil administration, civil affairs like identity, passports, travel, work permits, all these things that were decided in Oslo. There were no serious legislative efforts to change them or to establish a de facto situation against them or whatever. No. The PLC in Gaza, the Hamas members in Gaza, continued and issued about 34 laws from 2007. Part of them are related to disobedience against Oslo, a law that protecting the laws. The other is criminalizing ceding Jerusalem, and a law for the right of return. They modified the personal status personal status, allowing people who come through the tunnels to get identity cards. Those were in Gaza, but in the West Bank, all laws did not violate the boundaries of Oslo. And another thing is that there was a premeditation to keep the old structure of laws, the colonial structure, and not violating them seriously. Those who occupied us were, and especially the British and the Israelis, were people who used the law as a tool in a major manner in their colonizing efforts. And Israel, I can refer you back to Rajesh Hadi book that the occupation was also a very complicated, had a very complicated legal system that confiscated land and imposed control on resources and restricted freedoms. The British as well, the land law and law for land that facilitated the confiscating of land, and the Jordan also used the law for imposing control. But what draws the attention is that there was no systematic approach towards dismantling these legislations. So far, we are still living under the umbrella of these laws. Unfortunately, sometimes we adhere to them. And I give you a little example. The basic law, Palestinian basic law, for instance, states that no Palestinian can be arrested without a court decision. And there is an old Jordanian law that was changed in Jordan of 1956, which is called Preventing Crimes. This allows the governor or the administrator to bring someone, to issue an order and to arrest someone without an accusation, but based on not to prevent the occurrence of a crime. Now, many people in the Palestinian Authority now they stick to this law and believe it's very important, despite the fact that it violates the basic law, and there has been no serious efforts to change it. And the other thing is. The Palestinian laws, if we count them all together in the number from 20 years, from Oslo 1994 until 2014, 20 years, the number of these laws, if we remove the modifying or amendment laws, like, for instance, the investment promotion law was amended 7 times. Water was, the anti-corruption was 3 times. The audit bureau, and so many laws were modified and amended. So if you remove these amendment laws, then the laws which are the laws which were really issued by the Palestinian Authority about 80 or 90, while the Israelis issued 1,600 military. The Jordanian, I don't know, but so this is similarity. The other similarity is that the policies that cover these laws, there is no serious differences among these policies that cover these laws. There are 3 main fields: the PLC and the other legislative. That first one that is related to establishing the institutions of the PLC, the public office, pension, resources, budget regulation, anti-corruption, audit bureau, regulating within the law, focusing on the judicial authority and relating to procedures at the courts and these things. And the third one is the economic activity. We had many laws, economic laws of economic nature, bonds, market, capital market, monetary authority, and things that are related to companies. All the company, the laws regarding to the private sector. Mr. Raja knows better than me. Most of these laws care for a big company or regulate the work of big institutions that form no more than 20% of the Palestinian economy. Most of the Palestinian economy is formed of medium and small enterprises. So the promotion, investment promotion, communication laws, and other laws, and establishing the laws that allowed for establishing certain companies. All these are related to big economic institutions and do not really regulate the larger sector of medium and small enterprises and family businesses in the economy. They don't regulate them. There is a weakness in the social legislation. The Palestinian Authority for 20 years its social legislation are very, very limited, if not even existing. like the personal status families and the only go back to the Jordanian law of 1970s or 67, before 67, regarding the social rights. A number of laws were issued, like the handicapped law, the general retirement law, the third one, and if I remember, the student fund. There are certain laws that have social importance, but most of these were not put into action and were not abided by, and including the handicap or the handicap, or except the handicap law for the handicap, which was abided by symbolically. Some people say we don't have a rule of law. Yes, true. Yeah, but the application of law is something different. There is a graduality in applying laws. A good part of these laws, which were issued in 20 years, I believe these some of these laws create privileges and do not establish rights. By, for instance, the rights, duties, and rights of PLC members. These are not rights. These are privileges. The civil service is privileges. The diplomatic corps, diplomatic is also the retirement of the head of the audit bureau. These are privileges, and there is a good commitment to these laws by the executive authority, because there are people who would demand these privileges. But laws that are establish bodies that give certain powers, certain bodies, yes, like the land for the, the law for the land authority in Palestine. We have, in my opinion, among the things that were ignored, neglected by the authority. The most important thing for the citizens is land on a national level and on a personal level. Most of the problems and quarrels and people killing each other and the discrimination against the law and by denying women heritage is because of this land issue. The authority issued the law for establishing a land authority, which is establishing a body. The body is applying the Ottoman and British and Israeli laws. That's all. So the laws that are establishing bodies and institutions are applied, but laws that are imposing restrictions on the freedom of people according to political situation, they are applied. But laws that give rights to the people that needs financial commitment on the part of the authority, they are not applied at all. And there are no laws. The law for general retirement, people with disabilities and student funds, their application is very weak. So these are the similarities. Regarding the parties or the political forces and social forces that are behind these laws and legislations are the same, are similar. Three main parties. One, we have the funders or the donors, and they play an important role in defining the trends and which way we should go in legislation, but they don't intervene in the content. So most of these laws are related to the governance sector. And of course, they are interested in this sector, governance and rule of law. Most of the laws are related to governance and rule of law. 70% of the laws are related to governance and rule of law. So the funders, they decide the agenda where we should really work on legislations, but they don't intervene much in the content, except in one case that they fragrantly intervened, which is the amended Basic Law of 2003, where they imposed on it the establishment of the position of Prime Minister that, in my opinion, really paved the way for the division that we witnessed later. And the other trend is the offices within the executive authority. either security, bureaucratic, or political elites, and other parts that were issued after 2007 as by decrees, by law, behind of which there are people like the law for sports, or there is someone behind them, the academy, the security academy in Jericho, there is someone behind it. And there are certain laws that are known that were brought and were pushed forward to be enacted by certain persons. So without mentioning the names, we don't have to mention the names. The other influential party is the NGOs, the NGO sector, and I believe this passed through two stages. One before the division or political rift, in which there was a PLC, Legislative Council, and the role of the NGO sector was to do lobbying and to try to intervene in the content of legislations or suggest legislations to the PLC. And I think their role was very positive and was constructive at that period. And there were real discussions at that time. There were real discussions, and the NGO sector was really suggesting legislations that are of importance for the citizens, not the donors. Not after the rift in 2007, 2008. I don't know if you agree with me or not. The civil society or the NGOs was really absorbed to a large extent through many tools that the executive authority has become more sophisticated, more intelligent, and more capable of dealing with the civil society, and therefore it became more responsive. Like when the human rights institution would send a letter, executive authority, they will respond. If they have a workshop, the minister will come and open it. So the civil society organizations are also involved, are allowed to involve in the plans, 5 years plan, and all sectors. The authority is insisting that civil society should be represented in such meetings. And so this really allowed the civil society to play a superficial role on the expense of the real things. So in the absence of the PLC, in the absence of the PLC, then the authorities started to rely on consulting the civil society, but without really counting on them. Every year, there is a budget that is rejected by the PLC members. And the minister is keen to meet with the civil society organizations to present to them. He doesn't prevent everything. However, there is a kind of involvement of the civil society. There is a kind of acceptance towards this. For instance, if they have a plan for agriculture, they would tell civil society, we want participation or justice. They want participation. So the funders played an important role in this. The civil society as well. Many of the initiatives that are proposed by the civil society are really serving the interests of the funders. So if there is a certain interest, then they would really suggest a law. And the civil society started to assume a major role. The PLC used to do a hearing, to organize hearings called the civil society. Nowadays, the civil society organizes hearings and invite the PLC. The PLC became guests for the civil society, and the civil society started leading the legislation process. So particularly during the Salam Fayyad, when he was handling the fund assistance fund, and according to that he used to give grants to non-governmental organizations, political grants without any standards. As I was preparing research on my PhD thesis, I obtained a list of institutions that got these grants. A good number of them belong to Fatah, but others were leftists, and they were getting direct assistance from the authority. This gave gave the civil society, they provided the civil society an unreal feeling of their importance. The 70 laws that were issued by the president, I have not seen any influence by the civil society. They are economic laws. The laws that were issued from 2007 until now by the president, three types laws that are within the context of division and fighting Hamas and preventing to reoccurrence of what happened in Gaza in the West Bank, and to prevent what happened in 2006 and elections and the coming elections, and changing the election system, and changing the local elections law that allows the minister to dissolve councils, and the Minister of Interior also is allowed to dissolve committees and commissions and societies and confiscate their belongings. Another law is preventing the Hamas militia and preventing any military action in the West Bank by Hamas. And another law which is anti-money laundering law. These laws came within the context of fighting against Canada. There was another law like amending the company laws that would allow establishing new type of companies, and the monetary authority and the investment promotion law was modified 4 or 5 times, and another group of laws that were established according to certain vision of certain people in the ministries, and this doesn't mean that they are negative. Like, for instance, the student fund, it was, for instance, is one of the best laws and things that were done, and the minister at that time was behind it. It was good. Another thing. And among the similarities of these laws, there's a difference and there is a split between policies, legislations, and budgets. I don't want to say schizophrenic thing, but there is a lack of harmony among these three aspects. If you read the plans issued by the Minister of Planning and sectoral plans, you don't find them reflected in the legislation. The contrary legislations contradict. The plan says, for instance, we have to go ahead towards decentralization in the local government, and you will find that the law for the local councils, local governance will give priority to centralization. There are many plans that have no budget, like, for instance, the development plan and the establishment of the state. They are not linked to the public, to the general budget of the state. So when you ask the Ministry of Planning, where they say we do it as a tool for fundraising, not a real plan. So this is a wish. If you give us money, we'll apply this. But there is no big commitment to it. Now, let me just tackle quickly the laws issued by Hamas from 2007. These laws from 2007 until now, there is a great focus on the social aspect. Like issued a law for education. According to their and a law for the zakat and religious tax, and then they modified it, a law for personal status, and the law for personal status and civil affairs, and then they started working on the penalty law, but when there were criticism against flogging and things like that, then they retreated. So there were efforts to exceed the ceiling of Oslo by enacting laws that are considered against Oslo. The dangerous thing here is when we had the Authority Council and the PLC, they considered legislation as a tool for unifying West Bank and Gaza. Nowadays, drafting laws is a tool for creating rifts and division, and probably it will be difficult to exceed or to overcome overcome some of the influences, because these laws created power centers of powers and privileges, and it will be difficult. And the effort of reunifying the laws, it will need a long time and needs wisdom and review for every one of these laws. The last point that I would like to mention, particularly so that we go back to legislation without legislators from 2007 until now, 110 laws or 70 laws issued by the president. Part of them, there were some societal consultation, but this is however, elite, and all these laws are elite-based method and elite-based policy making. So there are experts that formulate these laws. There are no policies or laws that came from the bottom up to the PLC. The laws of 2007, some of them were subjected to consultation deliberation, but a large part of them, we never heard of them except from the papers that he signed. The president have signed this, and this created the opportunity that some of these laws which issued during this period did not really represent balanced interests, but represented interests of certain groups who were able to access the president office and get these laws. So within this situation, and the talk about reconciliation, I read the provisions in these agreements of reconciliation, and I did not see anything serious related to the laws. In the past, we used to say that we had Ottoman, Jordanian, British, Israeli laws. Now we have a new layer of laws, which is West Bank and Gaza laws, a new layer of laws that we have the influence of which we have to deal with in the coming period. Thank you.
Thank you, Ammar, for this important intervention in which you presented a panoramic description which is comprehensive about the question of legislation. The focus probably reflected a different theme, which is rather than legislation without legislators, but legislators without legislation, because there are so many legislators, since there are so many people who influence legislation, but there is an absence of legislation because of the very few number of pieces of legislation, and because of this tendency to preserve the colonial legislative power and the absence of any trend to dismantle this structure, and to avoid any clashes with this structure as a legacy, in addition to the absence of a legislative council that affected or undermined this legislative structure. And these are important issues that are worth of discussion. But now we give the floor to Mr. Raja Al-Khaldi, who will give a paper about, is there a Palestinian economy? This is also a very important and core question on which we can build so many other issues, whether it be in the area of development or elsewhere. Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Majdi and Ammar. I am sure, although it is a very complicated situation, we have so many legal people to solve this problem. Good morning. In fact, I will give my presentation in English because it is the result of some work which I began this year based on a request from a German university who wishes to publish a book on the self-rule experiences in Palestine and Kurdistan. And the theme they wanted me to cover was, what is the Palestinian economic system? And I said to them, what kind of system you speak of? And thus we began the debate, and the detailed paper, of which I will only present a part today, its title is The Economies of the Periphery, Reconnecting the fragmented Palestinian economy of Palestine. While the question today is much simpler. Is there a Palestinian economy? And this question stemmed from the presentation of this paper a few months ago in a university in the US. And therefore, we will focus on this question. But on a wider context, I will not delve into politics or into the Palestinian existing political or economy, of which I wrote a lot in previous years. I will try to expand the horizon, so please bear with me.
وأبدأ الورقة في اقتباس لراؤول بريبش. راؤول بريبش كان من كبار الاقتصاديين الأرجنتينيين، وهو مؤسس المنظمة اللي أنا كنت فيها، منظمة الأمم المتحدة للتجارة والتنمية. وفي سنة 82 ألقى محاضرة في الأونكتاد في سلسلة محاضرات راؤول بريبش اللي تستمر حتى اليوم، المحاضرة الأولى، وقال، وأنتقل للإنجليزي الآن: What is more, the great prosperities of the centers spread quickly and in many cases uncontrollably to the periphery. We tried more and more to imitate the advanced forms of consumption of the centers, owing to great disparities in income distribution. The heart of the matter was the poor income distribution which characterizes developing countries. This is what enabled the upper class to assimilate rapidly the forms of consumption of the centers, to the detriment of the accumulation of reproductive capital. During these years of prosperity, we on average achieved high rates of economic growth too, but in absolute terms, the masses remained as they were. No progress has been made in solving this grave social, economic, and human problem. When Don Raúl Prebisch reflected with some impatience over 30 years ago on the meager outcomes of global economic development, the study of which he himself had helped to pioneer many decades earlier, he was also looking forward. The core observations of his dependency theory, that he elaborated first in the 1950s, inform more than any other intellectual tradition what has today come to be known as development studies, and I'm sure some of you are experts in, like me. In their broadest schematic substance, his observations ring as true today as they did when he revisited them in his twilight years back in 1982. Then, on the eve of the latest wave of globalization, dependency theory had been relegated to a distant, malign corner of the new international intellectual scene, which was dominated by the emerging neoliberal thought. In the atypical case of Palestine, the economic transformations arising over 60 years of a colonial confrontation have seen the emergence of a dominant industrialized Israeli Jewish center, at the periphery of which fragments of a once agrarian Palestinian Arab economy continue to function. If only for diagnostic and definitional purposes, dependency analysis frames the investigation of that relationship in consistent and demonstrative terms. The main principles of dependency analysis provide a framework for a global analysis of modern capitalism, if not an all-embracing theory. These principles include the denial of dualism and modernization theses of development, the affirmation of chronic unequal exchange between the industrialized northern center and the less industrialized southern peripheries that limits the latter's developments, and the debate about the need for state policy and institutional intervention towards a socialist economic model and the role of the national bourgeoisies in that process. This heritage retains not only a useful function in analyzing and better understanding interregional dynamics and shifts in today's liberalized world economy. Dependency analysis also offers lessons for understanding the challenges of development at the national and regional levels, and guidelines for maintaining development policy space in the face of the uncontrolled expansion of global financial capital from the center. A traditional reading of the map as it evolved from 1947 to 1967, and especially after 1994, suggests a narrative that neatly partitions the area of historic Palestine into two territories: peoples, and economies. One for the state, the Jewish state, or the state of Israel, and another for the still not born state of Palestine. All efforts, political efforts, continue to achieve a settlement along these contours. Indeed, the territories in parts of the West Bank under the jurisdiction of the self-governing Palestinian Authority and the economy that they encompass are conventionally, by all of us in fact, considered by analysts and policymakers as the Palestinian economy of this putative state. This economy is supposedly amenable to the usual set of policies and laws suitable for dealing with development challenges as they may be applied in any middle-income developing country. The economy of the occupying power, Israel, is conceived of within this narrative as a separate, globally linked economic entity unto itself, pursuing its own distinctive economic trajectory. Even while Israel retains unilateral policy-making power over the relatively insignificant economy of the occupied territory, it is supposedly feasible to have a bilateral relation between the Israeli economy and a future Palestinian economy, and one that delivers mutual benefits. That was, of course, the premise of Oslo and Paris. This generally accepted dichotomy sets the scene for comparing development indicators here and there and gaps between the two economies within the same framework. It provides a very convenient assumption of parity and supposed amenability of problematic issues to resolution, and eventual even mutuality of interests, interdependence, fitting comfortably within the two-state paradigm. Such market-based understandings of the Palestinian economy, which are widely translated into policy and laws, again, today, find their roots in the standard conceptual framework for analyzing Arab-Jewish economic relations and performance in the British Mandate period, so-called dualism. This assumes the existence of two separate economies within the broader Mandate economy, interacting selectively, but each on a development path determined by its own capital financial assets, technological capacities, entrepreneurial culture, and social structure. According to this version of history, a Jewish, European-originated industrial, capital, and technological head start began a century ago, while a socially and politically fragmented and culturally constrained Arab population still has yet to fully shed its agrarian roots and embrace modernization and the pursuit of economic utility. All these people, the Palestinians, need, in this viewpoint, is a good dose of market-based economic liberalism, and the comparative advantages of each economy will realize mutual welfare advantages. In these dualist eyes, the very idea that we have, the Palestinian people have, that the gradual colonization of Palestine and the attrition of its indigenous Arab economic resources, that these are central causes of these gaps, or our idea or our belief that an adverse path of dependency was created many, many years ago, for dualists, this is politicization of pure economic analysis. They will dismiss the Palestinian Arab understanding that the development challenge has never been primarily one of economic modernization, but rather one of confronting, adapting to, and coping with a massive settler colonial enterprise with international dimensions and incontestably superior financial and technological power. When surveying the Palestinian economy in its broadest geographic extent, Raoul Prebisch's depiction of the structural dependency of the poor, commodity-producing peripheries on the prosperous, industrialized center seemed to demonstrate, to me at least, an underlying dynamic that binds the Palestinian economies to Israel. Dependency theory was rooted in a historical understanding of the adverse economic relation between colonial Europe and the United States, on the one hand, with the regions of Asia, Africa, Latin America that it conquered and from which it extracted resources for many centuries. This framework, therefore, provides a helpful entry point for going beyond the misleading picture of market normalcy and legislation and all that comes along with state building, that is implied by the prevailing dualist and neoliberal interpretations of the Palestinian Israeli economic relationship. And dependency theory remains coherent with structuralist and Marxist analysis of the economics of settler colonialism and capitalism. While I believe the dependency theory captures perhaps more accurately the spatial, material, and power dimensions, political power dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian economic struggle. So, with the failure of mainstream analysis of Palestinian development to really explain why we're in the mess we're in, an old-school approach should not be disregarded as a conceptual framework for comprehending the evolving Palestinian-Israeli, or I would say Arab-Jewish, economic entanglement in Palestine, especially today as the inevitable logic of unfettered colonialization and exclusion has revealed all its dimensions. So let's look at the bigger picture to try and assess what the Palestinian economic system is. Official treatments of the Palestinian economic system may still contrast one Palestinian economy within the borders of the West Bank and Gaza Strip against one Israeli economy. But realities on the ground and the dynamics underpinning the relationship between the dominant Israeli-Jewish macroeconomy and the Palestinian Arab microeconomies or markets within its orbit, these realities refute any static dualism and instead point to a very special 21st century version of a center-periphery dependency syndrome. Conventional wisdom continues to delineate the Palestinian economy as the archipelago economy under jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, the now severed, at least isolated and besieged, war-torn economy of Gaza, and, in principle, the East Jerusalem Palestinian economy annexed to Israel since 1967. In the minds of politicians, experts, pundits on both sides of the conflict, these fragments somehow are supposed to be reconstituted in one entity in the rosy scenario of a two-state solution that gives birth to an independent and contiguous Palestinian state. Rosy indeed. This implies a classic case of faulty theory masking and perpetuating a process that has been proceeding since before 1948. Namely the continued building of a Jewish state of Israel against the diminishing space and prospects for building an Arab state of Palestine. In a cruel twist of history, the part of the 1947 Partition Resolution 181 concerning the establishment of the Jewish state has been more than fully implemented. But the real political horizon today for a Palestinian Arab state emerging in line with the spirit of that resolution is dim, indeed non-existent. And to add irony to tragedy, another provision of that resolution has become reality despite never having been agreed to politically. And that was that while the land should be partitioned, the dual economy of pre-48 should not be. Under partition, the two states were to maintain an economic union that was designed in 1947 with the intent of delivering mutual growth and development benefits after independence of both states. But since 1967, of course, Israeli law, regimes, policies, and standards constitute the overriding sole sovereign economic, trade, and financial power throughout the territory of the state and the occupied territories, even in isolated Gaza. And any exceptions to this framework granted to the Palestinian Authority are limited and administrative in nature. The union is not only de facto, since 20 years of the Oslo Accords and the Paris Protocol succeeded in creating a mutually agreed interim period that is actively kept alive 20 years later by all parties, and indeed, as Ammar mentioned, even the laws do not dare go out of that framework, the lawmaking. With Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip fully integrated into the Jewish economy, Palestinian-Israeli economic union is arguably today de jure on both sides of the now largely unmarked and increasingly obliterated green line. Something else is often overlooked in this linear leap from mandate dualism to the mantra of two states and two economies for two peoples. Aside from the Palestinian people in exile, numbering some 6 million, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip are not the only Arabs living within that economic union, nor do Israeli planners see the territories, the occupied territories, as the sole space of Arab demographic and economic presence in what they see as Eretz Israel. Palestinian Arabs who were able to remain in their villages within 1949 armistice lines became Israeli citizens and constitute what official policy refers to today as the Arab or minorities sector. To all intents and purposes, this Palestinian Arab space in Israel constitutes yet another fragment of the formerly dual economy. Any formula for leveraging today, any formula for leveraging economic development to strengthen the position in a broader struggle for national liberation and to break the dependency cycle must include that untapped asset of the Arab economy in Israel. Political imperatives and correctness may well continue to dictate the contours of a hypothetical Palestinian economy for an elusive state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip for the foreseeable future. But the realities of the still present but increasingly shattered Arab economy of Palestine and the experience of Palestinian political, social, and economic reconnection despite borders over the Green Line, between Jerusalem and the West Bank, between the north of the West Bank and Galilee, all of these phenomena dictate another story. The alternative narrative, my alternative narrative, concurs that indeed there remains a distinct Palestinian economy, quote unquote, within the historic territory of Palestine. And two distinct economic models do coexist within that territory. The predominant globalized, industrialized, financialized, technologized, OECD-ized Jewish economy of the State of Israel. And within that Israeli economic security colonial envelope, an Arab economy also endures. Its development trajectory was interrupted by colonization before 1948 and by geopolitics since. But there is a real Palestinian economy out there. But the Palestinian economy today, it is not homogeneous, it is hardly interconnected, and actually does not constitute a coherent entity like the Jewish counterpart. And hence, it is not the other party to a misleading dualist model. It is neither post-agrarian nor industrializing. It's not a service economy, it's not an export economy. Instead, the usual process of economic structural transformation of developing countries has been suspended in the web of interest associated with the endurance of the Israeli state building and colonization project, as well as the no less degrading impacts of local, regional, and global capitalist expansion. Hence, the potential for Palestinian economic development has been thwarted consistently by both the shocks in the peripheries of the colonial confrontation, ongoing daily colonial confrontation, and the extreme and by, in many ways, unequal exposure of the Palestinian people to liberalization, privatization, globalization, within the context of dependency links at various levels with Israel, but also with Jordan and the Gulf states, all of which processes were fostered by the PA policies since 1994. So the economy of Palestine, such as it is actually constituted by different, diverging, core Arab regions. Despite economic attrition or stagnation, they have resisted, each one has resisted, by legal, demographic, or political means, the absolute exclusivist logic of colonial encroachment. These are the remnants of the indigenous Arab economy of Palestine and the economy of Palestine today. Four, I would say, more distinct enclave economies scattered from the north to the south and the east, from the east to the west of the area under Israeli sovereignty. The core, of course, is West Bank, what I call West Bank 1. Ramallah and the core cities where the Palestinian Authority has been able to fully exercise the neoliberal economic and social model in all its aspects, well, in as many aspects as permitted. Secondly, in the rest of the West Bank, we have three sub-economies. We have, though part legally of the PA economy, Al-Khalil, Hebron, is an economy unto its own, for various reasons I won't go into here. Area C is an economy and a territory unto its own. The north of the West Bank, for various reasons, is an economy slightly moving in its own direction. East Jerusalem, annexation, isolation, disintegration. Gaza Strip, some form of Islamic neoliberalism that really couldn't go all the way. And then, of course, the Arab economy in Israel. Each of these is on its own path of dependency or autonomy in relation to the economy of the Israeli metropole, having lost each one of them abruptly the historic contiguity that would have kept them together in the dualist scenario. Each is peripheral to the Jewish center, despite their continued usefulness for Israeli resource extraction in certain respects. Each is peripheral to the regional, Middle East, and global economies, hostage to the national, so-called Jewish-Israeli economy for external trade, financial, and other access. And in most respects, each is peripheral to each other, having been divided forcibly in 1948, reconnected in 1967, and then formally united in 1994, separated since 2001, and now only reconnected partially in recent years under new and stringent conditions. This is the reality of the Palestinian economic system, in fact, the Palestinian economic non-system in Palestine today, both on the map and in the real policy-making world. Regardless of the efforts to save the two-state solution, for policymakers and analysts to constantly flog the dead horse of a future dualist economic model is not useful for understanding the balance, the real balance of power, of economic power. Indeed, the idea of a Palestinian-Israeli two-state economy somehow suited to the globalized economy of the 21st century and the prevailing liberal economic model is increasingly a problematic prospect. And I've worked on such a prospect for 15, 20 years in the United Nations. Such a configuration risks locking in structural deformations and fragmentation that I just described within a broader scheme of Israeli colonial control, facilitating unfettered Israeli, Arab, and international capitalist penetration